Now, as we just mentioned, the U.S. has just unveiled sanctions against Russia. This comes as retaliation against an attempt to interfere with the 2016 U.S. presidential election. For more on the tit-for-tat action, Bloomberg's News' Ben Brody joins us right here. So, Ben, what's known about the retaliatory effort right now? We're getting these headlines crossing.
Right, so this is coming across even as we're sort of talking about it.
Yeah.
But what we do know is that this is aimed at basically isolating people connected to Russian intelligence, that's the GRU, isolating them on the international stage, making it harder for them to do international monetary transfers, making it harder for them to get bank accounts on the international stage, and generally just harder to work, especially in Europe and in the United States. In Russia, it's a different story. They can still act.
So how effective have we found these kinds of sanctions to be, particularly against individuals in the past?
So what we've sort of been looking at is the sanctions that went in place after the annexation of Crimea. It did not necessarily pull Vladimir Putin back. He wasn't necessarily stopping his sort of territorial ambitions in light of those. It was really the falling price of oil that sort of was the only check on him during that period. And so it's not clear necessarily that these are going to be very effective.
Now, there are reports about the expansion of economic penalties as well as some expansion of this from 2015. What more on this?
Well, so the way this sort of works is they're going to be putting out a sort of presidential, order, and it basically he orders the Treasury Department to do this, and it's an expanded base to do it based on cyber attacks. And I think we're going to be seeing a lot more of these in the future as these kinds of battle over our digital infrastructure becomes, sort of the crucial battlefield.
And yet, we heard from Donald Trump last night speaking about how, computers, who understands
They're so
them?
complex.
They're so complex.
Right.
What can you do? Kind of a thing. So what ability will he have to just reverse the sanctions once he gets into office?
Right.
So it's basically his Treasury Department and his executive orders. Now, it's not clear exactly what he plans to do. They have said that their approach to sanctions is that they want sanctions that work, and they haven't said whether or not they think the Russian sanctions work. But it's his Treasury Department and it's his executive orders. And so when he comes into office, yes, theoretically, after January 20th, he has broad authority to roll back some of these.
And what's really interesting and concerning by many is that he's already setting up this tension with his intelligence agencies, talking about the Russian, alleged Russian attack. Right now, crossing also, the FBI and Homeland Security said that they're going to offer declassified evidence on this attack. Do we even know if he's going to actually listen?
We don't know, and he's certainly been very dismissive of those in the past, even when they did come from, what we call the intelligence community, that sort of broad umbrella, several groups. So he might not listen to it. He's not necessarily obliged to listen to it. But what I think we will see some impact here is there are several hawkish Republicans, especially on Russia, in the Senate, and they will be overseeing confirmation hearings of Rex Tillerson. That's, of course, the Secretary of State designate, nominee, and they're going to be holding hearings, and they're not necessarily going to be pleased to hear that Tillerson or Trump are not necessarily going to help them push back on Russia in this situation.
So the story that Raymond was referring to about the FBI releasing some more of this information, our story saying that it's intended to serve two purposes: to help prove that the Russian government was behind this, and also frustrate officials in Moscow by exposing some of their most sensitive hacking infrastructure, so sort of the technical aspects of this operation. So we've been talking about sanctions. We've been talking about what the U.S. can do to try to prevent this through sort of political and sanction means. What about sort of the U.S. firewall, if you will? What measures has the U.S. been taking? And what can they do? What can we do to prevent this sort of thing from happening?
I think we are on the precipice of an escalating cyber war. It's with Russia. It's happened some with China. And so, on the one hand, we're presumably doing a lot that we can. Not all of these details are necessarily public or accessible. On the other hand, this is just the beginning of this. This is going to be ongoing, and it's going to continue to escalate. And I think it's important, though, to say that President Obama this name and shame tactic that you mentioned before, not necessarily being able to come out and say, okay, this is the latest firewall, this is the one that's going to keep out the Russians or the Chinese or whoever else. They have said, well, we're going to name and shame, we're going to expose you. And that's sort of been a policy and a weapon that the Obama administration has been using here.
And Ben, thank you very much. We're going to have to leave it there, but a couple other lines crossing the Bloomberg right now off of this. You were talking about the GRU. Those sanctions do include the chief, the deputy chief, and the first deputy chief of the GRU. Also, the New York Times is reporting that the U.S. is ejecting 35 Russian intel operatives from the country off of this. But Ben Brody, thanks very much.